Now, President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine has wrapped up a tour of the Arab countries currently most threatened by Iranian attack. He's visited Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, as well as Jordan, signing defense agreements built on Ukraine's expertise in downing Russian drones. Zelensky has called those deals historic.
I believe these are historic agreements. We are reaching understanding on strategic cooperation in the militech sector and in other areas. We are talking about 10-year agreements. This is mutual assistance unquestionably. We are also interested in anti-ballistic capabilities. You know we have a shortage in this area. We also face challenges related to energy.
With me live on the programme now is Samuel Ramani. He's an associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute to talk a little bit with us about Zelensky's trip to the Middle East. Good to have you here on France 24.
Yeah, good to be here.
First of all, Volodymyr Zelensky isn't sharing his anti-missile technology with Gulf states purely out of altruism, is he? Why do you think he's agreed to do this?
Well, I mean, I think that this is a geostrategic move for the Ukrainians because obviously the Gulf countries have been extremely ambivalent on the war in general, right? They've straddled a boundary between Russia and Ukraine. The UAE has been an important alternative financial outlet for the Russians. The Saudis have been important for oil price regulation. So this is a way for the Ukrainians to get the Gulf countries maybe closer to their side, and in turn get some of the countries in the global south that they've invested in also on their side. And secondly, it's also important for the Ukrainians to show their usefulness to the Americans at a critical time because they can provide drone interceptors that are more effective than American Patriot missiles in terms of shooting down Iranian drones. And that encourages the Americans to keep supporting them in their war against Russia. So I think that this is a major geostrategic effort, as well as also an economic one, because Ukrainian startups and the Ukrainian defense industry needs foreign investment. The Gulf is going to have a major defense spending boom after this war, and therefore it's going to also feed into Ukraine's economy too.
Okay, so that's a sense then of why this might benefit Ukraine. What about in countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, countries obviously that are very wealthy in their own right? Do they really need this Ukrainian expertise?
I think that they're finding themselves in a situation where they're struggling to match up with the level of Iranian drones and the number of them and the frequency and the amount of disruption that they'll cause. For example, when Ukrainian engineers came on the ground in Saudi Arabia, one of the reports was that the Saudis were sometimes using up to 6 interceptors against a drone swarm, whereas a single drone-to-drone interceptor could have been much more cost-effective and much more efficient in terms of taking on those kinds of technologies. Moreover, I think the Qataris and the Saudis and the Emiratis want to harmonize their militaries with the developments that are coming in the United States. And in the U.S., you have the Lucas drones that have been developed that are much like Shaheds, mimics of Shaheds, that are now low cost and now being used. So it's important that the Gulf countries have the similar kind of offensive drone technologies that the Americans can bring, but also the same kind of defensive ones too. So the Ukrainians are actually playing an important role by giving drone interceptors that can harmonize the Gulf and American militaries and ensure that the Trump administration's drone war progress is now extending to the Gulf.
I want to ask you about something else President Zelensky has said today, now that he's back in Ukraine. He urged Russia to agree to a mutual pause on strikes on the energy sector. That's to say that Russia would stop hitting Ukrainian energy infrastructure, and Ukraine, Zelensky says, would stop hitting Russian infrastructure in return. Zelensky says that they should do this because of the oil crisis linked to the war in the Middle East. First of all, do you think Russia might agree to a deal like that? And how significant would it be should both sides do so?
This is something that's been discussed many times before. Actually, before the Kursk offensive in the summer of 2024, it was widely reported that the Qataris were actually trying to broker an agreement between the Ukrainians and the Russians on this very issue, the energy ceasefire. But then it unraveled because of the Kursk offensive and then Russia's subsequent relentless attacks on Ukrainian power grids. And now, in the context of the energy crisis, it's resurfacing again. There have been some reports that I've seen that the American officials are telling the Ukrainians to dial down on the attacks on Russian energy infrastructure, in part because they have an energy waiver now and they're concerned about anything that disrupts supply chains. And that might be Zelensky's motivation for kind of pushing this. But in general, trust and confidence building measures between the two sides are extremely thin. The only way in which talks have seemed to succeed has been on prisoner exchanges. And I think be a tough sell, especially because the Russians see any kind of movement of drone interceptors or missile defenses to the Gulf as a weakening of Ukraine's air defenses, and striking power grids just weakens that further. So I think that there's going to be continuing of an energy war between Ukraine and Russia, but this is a way for Zelensky to show he's receptive to any kind of American pressure to dial down strikes on his side. At least he can say, I've done all I can. The Russians are still attacking us, so we have to keep fighting back.
And just if we can go back to the deal with Gulf countries that Zelensky has now signed, how comparable are the battlefields that we're talking about here? Ukraine and Russia, Ukraine's air defense is working relatively well in a Ukrainian context. How well does that translate to what we're seeing in Iran and in the Gulf? I suppose it is worth emphasizing that the Shahed drones or similar models of them are being used on both battlefields.
Well, pretty much same with a similar kind of drones being used on both models, because now it's not just the Iranian Shaheds in exclusion that are probably being used in the Gulf. It's the Iranian Shahed drones plus Russian assistance, right? There's been a lot of reports now that the Russians are providing intelligence and also technological assistance in the drone space. So the Geran 2s that the Russians turned the Iranian Shaheds into, some of their technological advantages are now being seeping into the arsenals of the Iranians for Gulf use. So there's a lot of synergy between these two theaters. I mean, obviously, Ukraine very, very complex and heterogeneous air defense environment. Kyiv is very saturated with air defense systems, maybe some of the biggest concentrations in the world outside of the Iron Dome. But many other Ukrainian cities like Kharkiv, Odessa, and ones closer to the front line have much less air defense cover. In general, the Gulf is a much lower air defense covered space, except with the exception of some oil fields and some infrastructure. So I think that there's a lot of parallels and a lot of comparisons. And if these technologies can be proven to be effective, I think they could become a long-term part of the Gulf defense mix. And that will lead to Gulf investments in the major defense startups and also potential investments in the knowledge economy, AI, renewable energy, and reconstruction of Ukraine more broadly. So I think that there is enough synergy to make this worthwhile.
Samuel Ramani talking to us there. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.